All right, so today we're going to dive into something pretty significant, actually, the potential impact of a second Trump term on immigration,
Okay.
specifically for international students and folks hoping to get those employment-based green cards.
Right.
We'll be looking at a Forbes article that came out this week, November 5th, I believe it's called. Trump's immigration plans may upend students and immigrant applicants.
Yeah. And this is a really interesting one because it's not just like theoretical.
Right.
We have actual data from Trump's first term. We have some insights into what his advisors are thinking.
Yeah.
So we can start to piece together a picture of what might happen.
So using history as our guide, right?
Exactly.
So let's imagine you're an international student.
Yeah.
You're coming to the U.S., bright-eyed and bushy-tailed.
Yeah.
You want a world-class education.
Yeah.
What are some things you might need to be aware of if Trump gets a second term?
Well, one thing that really drove a lot of his policies in the first term was this idea of the lump of labor fallacy.
Okay.
It basically says there's only a fixed number of jobs, and if you let in more people, especially immigrants, that means fewer jobs for Americans.
Like immigrants are stealing American jobs.
Exactly. That's the kind of rhetoric you hear. But economists have largely debunked this idea.
Yeah.
It's not how the job market actually works. What we often see is that immigrants actually help create jobs.
Right.
They bring new skills, they start businesses, they contribute to the economy in ways that actually benefit everyone.
Yeah, it's like a rising tide lifts all boats kind of situation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but this lump of labor idea, it was really powerful in Trump's first term. And we saw it play out in things like the blocking of many immigrants and visa holders during the pandemic.
Oh, right. Yeah, they used COVID as kind of a justification for that.
Exactly. COVID was used as a justification. And so, there are concerns that those kinds of restrictions could come back.
So we could see something similar in a second term, potentially?
Yeah, potentially. And it's not just about general restrictions. There were targeted efforts to make it harder for foreign-born scientists and engineers to come to the U.S.
It seems kind of counterintuitive if the goal is to protect American jobs.
Right, because you would think we would want to attract the best and brightest from around the world.
Yeah, especially in those STEM fields.
Exactly. And that brings us to a program called Optional Practical Training, or OPT.
Right.
And this is basically a work authorization program that allows international students to get real-world experience in their field after graduation
Okay.
for up to 12 months. And it's really a win-win for students and for employers.
Yeah, because the students get to, you know, actually apply what they've learned, and the employers get access to a wider talent pool.
Absolutely. They get to, test out these potential employees and
Okay.
see if they're a good fit.
So I'm sensing this might be something that could be on the chopping block in a second Trump term.
It's definitely a program that's been targeted before. And, it's interesting to go back and look at the Obama administration because they actually extended OPT for STEM students
Oh, interesting.
to 24 months. So science, technology, engineering, and math.
So they're trying to keep those folks here longer.
Exactly. They recognized the critical need for those skills and wanted to make sure the U.S. was staying competitive.
So why would anyone want to restrict OPT? I mean, it seems like it's good for everybody.
Well, if you remember Stephen Miller, who was one of Trump's key advisors, he's known for his hardline stance on immigration.
Right.
And you have to look back at a bill he actually wrote in 2015. It was S-2934, and it proposed some major changes to the H-1B visa,
Okay.
which is how a lot of students on OPT transition to more permanent work status.
So basically trying to make it harder for them to stay.
Exactly. Yeah, making it harder for them to stay even though they've gotten an education here and gotten some work experience.
So even if they don't completely eliminate OPT, it sounds like it could be a lot harder to use.
That's what the Forbes article is pointing to, is that, even if they don't ban it outright, they can make it so complicated and so expensive that it becomes basically useless.
Like death by a thousand cuts.
Exactly. And we saw this with the H-1B visa. They increased denials, they slowed down processing times, they added all these confusing regulations.
Right.
And it just created this huge amount of uncertainty for both students and employers.
It makes it a lot less attractive, right?
Exactly. So it's not just about one specific policy. It's about creating this whole climate of uncertainty and potential roadblocks.
And I guess that uncertainty can be just as damaging as an outright ban in some cases.
Absolutely, because people need to be able to plan for their futures.
Right.
And businesses need to know that they can rely on a stable workforce.
Oh, okay. So we've talked about the impact on, students coming in, but what about those who are already here working, hoping to get a green card,
Yeah.
hoping to build a life in the U.S.? What are they facing?
That's another area where things could get really complicated. And the article focuses specifically on Indian applicants
Right.
who are already facing this massive backlog in the employment-based green card category.
We're talking years, right?
Years, yeah, years of waiting in limbo, not knowing what their future holds.
Yeah, and that can be so stressful to not know if you're going to be able to stay in the country you've built a life in.
Absolutely. It makes it incredibly difficult to plan for the future, to, put down roots, buy a house, all those things that come with feeling settled and secure.
So how likely is it that this situation could actually get worse in a second Trump term?
Well, there are a few policies that were, floated around during his first term that could really exacerbate this backlog.
Yeah.
One that stands out is the Department of Labor rule from 2020 that tried to increase the minimum salary requirements for H-1B visa holders and those applying for green cards through employment.
Oh, wow. So even if you have a job offer, even if you're fully qualified, you might not be able to get a green card if your salary isn't high enough.
Exactly. And we're talking about, in some cases, doubling the minimum salary. So it was clearly an attempt to, price people out of the market.
But wouldn't the argument be that that protects American workers,
Yeah,
make sure they're getting fair wages?
that's what they claimed. But, the research has actually shown that on average, H-1B visa holders are paid the same or even more than their American counterparts in similar roles.
So it's not really about protecting American workers.
It seems like it was more about, creating another obstacle for skilled immigrants trying to get a green card.
And didn't employers already have to pay a lot to sponsor H-1B visas and green cards anyway?
Oh, yeah. There are already thousands of dollars in fees involved, so it debunks this myth that, companies are just bringing in cheap labor.
So adding this huge salary hike on top of that would make it even less likely for employers to sponsor these workers.
Right. And this particular rule was eventually blocked by a judge.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean it's gone forever.
Right.
The article suggests that a second Trump administration could very well try again.
Oh, wow.
This time making sure they, dot their I's and cross their certain hats so it can't be challenged.
So for those already in the green card backlog, this could mean years of additional waiting, even more uncertainty about whether they'll be able to stay in the U.S.
And it's important to remember that this isn't just about numbers and statistics.
Yeah.
These are real people's lives.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that sometimes when you're talking about policy.
It is. And they've, built careers, they have families, they have kids in school, they have roots in their communities.
Yeah.
To have all of that hanging in the balance because of political maneuvering is just heartbreaking,
Yeah, it's a lot to take in, and it sounds like we've only just scratched the surface of how a second Trump term could impact immigration.
Yeah, we've just laid the groundwork here.
Right.
And in part 2 of this deep dive, we're going to go even deeper and look at some of the specific policy changes that could be on the table.
Okay, so stay tuned for that.
Yeah, and what they might mean for individuals and families.
All right, we'll be back in just a minute. So we've talked about folks hoping to come here to work and study, but what about those who are already here working,
Yeah.
waiting for that chance at a green card?
There's a ton of uncertainty around that as well. And, the Forbes article highlights a few specific things that were targeted during Trump's first term that could easily come up again.
Okay.
One that really stood out to me was this push to tighten the rules around unlawful presence for international students.
What exactly does that mean?
So basically, they were trying to make it a lot easier to penalize students for even minor unintentional violations of their visa status.
Okay.
So, even a small technicality could have led to deportation or being banned from coming back to the U.S.
Wow, so even if you're doing everything right, following the rules as best you can still get caught up in this.
Yeah, it was a real concern for students. And the thing is, it wasn't just about punishing those who had already messed up.
Yeah,
It was
right.
about creating this atmosphere of fear,
Right.
making international students think twice about even coming to the U.S. in the first place.
Yeah, if you're, a student from another country trying to decide where to study,
Hmm.
you're not going to pick a place where you feel like you're constantly walking on eggshells.
Right, exactly. You want to feel welcome. You want to feel like you can focus on your studies.
And you're not going to get kicked out over some tiny little mistake.
Exactly. And it's not just about the students themselves, universities, research labs.
Right.
The whole economy benefits from having these bright minds come here and contribute.
Yeah, it's kind of shooting ourselves in the foot.
Yeah, and policies like this, they send this message that, the U.S. isn't as open to global talent anymore, and that hurts everyone in the long run.
Yeah, it's like closing the door to innovation.
Exactly.
So another thing that came up during Trump's first term was this idea of limiting how long international students can stay in the U.S.,
Yep.
even if they're enrolled in, legitimate academic programs.
Right.
What was the thinking behind that?
Basically, another attempt to, reduce the number of international students in the country.
Oh,
But again, it's not just about the numbers, it's
yeah.
about sending this message.
Like, we don't really want you here long term.
Yeah, like come get your education, but don't get too comfortable.
Right, exactly.
And then, of course, there's the H-1B visa,
Right.
which is, the main way international students can transition from studying to working here, more permanently.
Right.
And if Trump cracks down on H-1Bs, that makes it that much harder for those students to stay.
And we saw that happen during his first term, right? More denials, longer processing times, tougher requirements.
All of that, yeah. And it wasn't just tough on the students, it was tough on American companies too,
Right, because they rely on these skilled professionals.
Exactly. They rely on them to fill these important roles. And, when you make it harder to hire them, everyone loses out.
So, okay, we've talked about students, but let's shift gears a little bit and talk about those who are already here working, hoping to get a green card through their job.
Right.
The article paints kind of a bleak picture for these folks, especially those from India.
Yeah. And, we talked about the backlog earlier, but it's worth really hammering home how big of a problem this is, especially for Indian applicants.
Right.
It's already this long, drawn-out process, and there's a real concern that a second Trump term could make it even worse.
We talked about that Department of Labor rule from 2020 that tried to increase the minimum salary requirements for H-1B visa holders and green card applicants. How likely is it that we see something like that come back around?
I mean, it's definitely a possibility. And remember, a judge blocked that specific rule.
Right.
But it was on a technicality. So if they do it by the book this time, it could be a real problem.
So you could have been working in the U.S. for years,
right?
Contributing to the economy, paying your taxes, building a life here, and then just because your salary isn't high enough, even though you're fully qualified for the job, you might not be able to get a green card.
Yeah, and again, that whole, protecting American workers argument.
It doesn't really hold water.
It just doesn't hold up. The research shows that's not really what's going on.
And employers already have to jump through all these hoops and pay all this money.
Oh, yeah. It's not a cheap or easy process.
To sponsor these visas and green cards?
Not at all.
So you add this massive salary hike on top of that.
Right.
It's going to discourage even more employers from sponsoring these workers.
Exactly. Even if they have the skills that are desperately needed.
And that, of course, makes the green card backlog even worse.
It's a vicious cycle. And it's not just about economics, These are people with families, kids in school.
They have roots here.
It's their
home.
Yeah, forcing them to leave because of these, bureaucratic hurdles.
That's heartbreaking.
It would be devastating, and it sends a terrible message to the rest of the world, If you're a skilled professional, are you going to choose to come to a country where the rules are constantly changing?
Where you don't know if you can stay.
And you could be forced to leave at any moment.
It's a big risk.
It is. And that kind of uncertainty can really hurt the U.S.'s ability to compete globally.
Right. Because we need to be attracting that top talent.
Exactly. We need to be rolling out the red carpet, not putting up more barriers.
So it's easy to get caught up in, all the policy details and the economic arguments.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, these are real people's lives we're talking about.
Absolutely. And there's so much anxiety and fear out there right now. It's important to acknowledge that and to have empathy for those who are facing this uncertainty.
And we can't forget that broader message that these policies send, about what kind of country the U.S. wants to be.
What do we value?
Do we want to be a nation that welcomes,
yeah,
talent and diversity?
Right.
Or do we want to kind of close ourselves off from the rest of the world?
It's a question we need to answer, and the choices we make are going to have a ripple effect.
Yeah,
sure. And not just on immigration, but on our economy, our culture, our place in the world.
So we've kind of focused a lot on the potential downsides here.
Yeah.
But, there are always multiple perspectives on complex issues like this.
Of course, it's important to hear those different viewpoints, even if we don't agree with them. So in the next part of this deep dive, we're going to explore some of those arguments in favor of stricter immigration policies and try to understand where they're coming from.
Okay, so we've spent a good chunk of time talking about potential downsides. But like you said, it's important to try to look at this from different sides.
Yeah, there are always multiple perspectives on complex issues like immigration.
So what are some of the arguments that people make in favor of stricter immigration policies?
Well, a common one you hear a lot is about, protecting American jobs and wages. The idea is that if you let in too many immigrants, it'll drive down wages or make it harder for Americans to find work.
It's that lump of labor fallacy again.
Exactly. And as we've discussed, economists have consistently shown that that's not really how things work in reality.
Right.
Immigration can actually lead to job creation and boost the economy overall.
It makes sense when you think about it. Immigrants are starting businesses, they're creating new products and services,
Yeah.
and they're also consumers. They're spending money, they're paying taxes.
Right. It's not a zero-sum game where one group wins and another loses.
Exactly.
Everyone can benefit.
Okay, so another argument you hear is about national security.
Yeah, the idea that stricter immigration controls are needed to keep the country safe.
We saw this with the Muslim ban during Trump's first term.
Right.
Did those kinds of policies actually make us any safer?
There's really no evidence to suggest that immigrants pose a greater security threat than native-born citizens. In fact, a lot of immigrants come to the U.S. precisely because they're seeking safety and opportunity.
Right. They're fleeing violence and persecution.
Exactly. And when you implement these sweeping bans based on religion or nationality,
Yeah.
you're not just being discriminatory, you're also potentially alienating people who could be, valuable allies in the fight against terrorism.
It seems like it would be much more effective to focus on, targeted vetting and intelligence sharing.
Right?
Rather than these broad brush policies that just end up hurting innocent people.
Absolutely. You want to be smart about it, not just reactionary.
So we've talked about economics and security. What about cultural concerns?
Yeah, that's another big one.
Right.
Some people worry that large-scale immigration could threaten American culture or lead to a loss of national identity.
That's a valid concern, right?
Yeah.
People want to preserve their traditions, their way of life.
Of course. But it's important to remember that the U.S. has always been a nation of immigrants. Our culture is a mix of so many different influences and traditions, and that's what makes us unique.
It's that melting pot idea.
Exactly. And when you look at history, those waves of immigration, they often brought new energy and ideas that ultimately strengthened the country.
Right. It pushed us forward.
Yeah. Trying to freeze culture in time or define some narrow version of American just doesn't reflect the reality of our history or our values.
So how do you balance those concerns about preserving culture with the benefits that come from welcoming immigrants and being open to the world?
It's a tough question, and there's no easy answer, but I think it starts with recognizing that change is inevitable.
Right.
And that diversity is a strength, not a weakness. We can honor our traditions and our heritage while also embracing the contributions of those who come here seeking a better life.
So where do we go from here? What can people do if they want to make a difference, if
Yeah.
they want to advocate for, more humane and welcoming immigration policies?
Well, I think first and foremost, stay informed. Read articles, listen to podcasts like this one, follow reputable news sources.
Right.
The more you understand the issues, the better equipped you'll be to have productive conversations and challenge misinformation.
It's about cutting through the noise and getting to the facts.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of your own voice. Contact your elected officials. Write letters to the editor.
Right.
Talk to your friends and family. Let those in power know that you care about these issues and that you support policies that are fair and humane.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed, but even small actions can make a difference.
Absolutely. Support businesses owned by immigrants. Volunteer at organizations that help newcomers. Get to know people from different backgrounds. These little acts of kindness and inclusion can have a ripple effect.
And if you're really passionate about this, consider supporting organizations that are, fighting for immigrants' rights.
Yeah.
Pushing for policy changes.
Yeah.
Donate your time or money. Attend rallies and protests. Use your skills to help amplify their message.
Exactly. Change doesn't happen overnight. But collective action driven by empathy and a commitment to justice can have a huge impact.
So as we're wrapping up this deep dive, I'm left with this question. If the U.S. really wants to be a global leader, a place where everyone has the chance to thrive, what kind of immigration system do we need to create one that's secure and compassionate, reflects our values, and helps us build a better future for everyone?
It's a question worth pondering, and the answers we come up with are going to shape not just the future of immigration, but the future of our country as a whole.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and thought-provoking.